What does it truly mean to know something? It feels like such a basic concept, doesn't it?
It really does.
We use that word, I don't know, dozens of times a day. I know my appointment is at 3. I know how to make coffee. I know that the earth revolves around the sun.
Sure, it's fundamental.
But if you actually stop and try to pin down a definition, figure out what really separates a true belief from genuine bona fide knowledge, well, it gets surprisingly complicated.
It absolutely does. For a very long time in Western philosophy, going all the way back to Plato, the standard answer, the prevailing view, was what's known as the justified true belief analysis, JTB for short.
JTB. Okay.
It seemed intuitive, elegant even, and it stood as the dominant definition for centuries.
Right. The idea was that knowledge was just having a belief that happened to be true, but with a crucial extra ingredient. Right. Justification.
Exactly.
It felt like that third piece, the justification, was what elevated, mere true opinion to the level of knowledge. But this long-held consensus, this seemingly solid definition, was dramatically disrupted in 1963.
That's right. A philosopher named Edmund Gettier published a paper titled "Is Justified True Belief Knowledge?" It was remarkably brief, only about 2.5 pages.
Wow, really? That short?
Yep. But its impact was seismic. Gettier presented these clever counterexamples, hypothetical situations where someone appeared to meet all 3 conditions of the JTB definition. Their belief was true, they believed it, and they had good justification for it. Yet, intuitively, we wouldn't say they actually knew it.
So JTB was met, but something was still missing.
Exactly. It showed JTB wasn't sufficient.
And that's the core puzzle we're diving into today. We're going to unpack that traditional JTB definition, explore Gettier's original cases, and some of the many others that philosophers have devised since.
There are quite a few famous ones.
Yeah, and then navigate the complex landscape of attempts to repair or replace the JTB definition over the last, 60 years or so? We've gathered a range of sources, foundational texts, in-depth encyclopedia entries, even some online discussions to guide us through this fascinating and, foundational problem in epistemology.
Because this isn't just an abstract game for philosophers, right? Understanding the Gettier problem and the subsequent debates gets right to the heart of what distinguishes reliable belief from lucky guesses in our own lives.
That's a great point.
It shapes how we think about evidence, certainty, and what makes a belief genuinely well-grounded versus merely happening to be true. It forces us to ask what more is needed for knowledge beyond just being right.
So let's unpack this challenge. Let's start by really understanding the traditional JTB view.
Yeah.
What are these 3 proposed components of knowledge?
Okay. The first condition is probably the most straightforward: truth. For you to know a proposition P simply must be true.
Right.
You cannot know something that is false. This feels like a fundamental requirement. If I say, I know the sky is purple, but the sky is actually blue, then I simply don't know that it's purple, no matter how strongly I believe it or, how I might try to justify that belief.
It seems obvious when you put it like that. You can't have knowledge of a falsehood.
Exactly. And it's important to be clear that truth here is generally understood as a metaphysical concept.
Metaphysical, meaning?
Meaning it's about how reality is independently of whether anyone knows it or can prove it.
Oh, okay.
A historical event happened in a certain way. And that's the truth of the matter, even if all records are lost, The truth condition doesn't require accessibility or proof. It requires that the fact actually obtains in reality.
So, like the example in our source.
Yeah.
You couldn't know that Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election because, as a matter of fact, she did not.
Precisely. The proposition Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election is false. So, end of story for any knowledge claim about it.
Okay, so first, the belief has to align with reality. It must be true. What's the second piece?
The second condition is belief. For you to know a proposition P, you must actually believe P.
Also seems pretty intuitive.
It does. If you don't even entertain the idea that it's raining outside, you can't possibly know that it is. Knowledge is considered a kind of mental state or achievement, and it's generally accepted that it requires holding the relevant belief.
I remember our sources mentioning a potential wrinkle here, though. What about cases like Albert? The guy who answers historical questions correctly but thinks he's just guessing.
Ah, yes, Albert. That's a great philosophical edge case.
Does he know the answers if he doesn't believe he knows them?
Well, that's the debate. Some philosophers might argue that Albert must have some form of tacit or unconscious belief because his responses are so reliable and accurate, the information is clearly in there somewhere.
Right. He's accessing it somehow.
Yeah. So maybe belief can include these non-conscious states. But generally, the JTB analysis and most of the debates following Gettier operate with the understanding of belief as conscious assent or acceptance of a proposition.
So, like, you have to actually think it's true.
Right. If Albert truly doesn't believe the answers are correct, even if they are, most analyses would say he doesn't know them, at least not in the standard sense that requires belief. He might have true information, but not knowledge per se.
Interesting distinction. So, requiring conscious belief seems to be the standard assumption in this discussion. Okay, so true belief seems necessary, but it's clearly not enough.
Yeah, definitely not.
You could believe something true purely by luck, like guessing a coin flip.
Absolutely. And that's where the third condition comes in. This is the condition that was supposed to rule out lucky guesses.
Yeah.
Justification.
The JOS and JTB.
Exactly. For you to know P, you must be justified in believing P. This is where the rubber meets the road. If you simply guess that a coin flip will land tails, and it does, you have a true belief, and you believe it.
But you weren't justified.
Right. You had no good reason, no evidence, no reliable process leading you to that belief, so you don't know it landed tails, you just got lucky.
And this idea goes way back too, right, to Plato, that true opinion isn't enough.
Spot on. In Plato's dialogue, Theaetetus, Socrates discusses this. He talks about how a jury might be persuaded by a clever lawyer to hold a true opinion about, say, a crime, even if they weren't witnesses and lack direct evidence.
So they believe something true, but just because they were convinced by rhetoric.
Right. Their opinion is true, but it's based on persuasion, not genuine understanding or sufficient evidence. Socrates suggests this isn't knowledge. Justification is meant to provide that missing link, the proper grounds, the evidence, the reasons, the reliable connection to truth that separates knowledge from lucky true belief.
Okay, so to summarize the traditional view, subject S knows proposition P if and only if 1, P is true, 2, S believes P, and 3, S is justified in believing P. That's the JTB analysis.
That's it. And for centuries, that was thought to capture the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge. It aimed to break knowledge down into these fundamental, sort of separable components.
It was treated as a definitional analysis, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Assuming that knowledge could be fully defined just in terms of these three prior concepts, it felt like a complete account.
And then boom, 1963, Edmund Gettier shows that it wasn't complete.
Precisely. His paper demonstrated that having justified true belief was not sufficient for knowledge.
Not enough on its own.
Right. He did this by presenting these hypothetical situations, these cases, where all three JTB conditions were undeniably met. Yet it seemed intuitively obvious that the person in the scenario did not possess knowledge. These Gettier cases are counterexamples to the sufficiency of JTB.
They show JTB might be necessary, but it's not the whole story.
Exactly.
And these cases are quite ingenious in their structure. Let's dive into his two original examples. First, the one involving Smith, Jones, a job, and some coins.
Okay, so the setup. Smith and Jones are applying for the same job. Smith has what he believes is very strong evidence that Jones will get the job. The source mentions this includes testimony from the company president, usually a very reliable source.
You'd think so.
Yeah, and Smith also directly observed Jones count the coins in his pocket and saw there were exactly 10.
Okay, so good evidence. Reliable testimony, direct observation. Smith forms a justified belief based on this.
Yes, he forms a belief based on what he takes to be solid grounds. He reasons, basically. Jones will get the job, and Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. From these premises, he validly infers the proposition P.
Let's call it B, like in the source.
Okay, belief B. The man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket.
Yeah.
He believes B, and given his strong evidence for the premises, he is highly justified in believing B.
Sounds reasonable. Now comes the classic Gettier twist.
The twist is that by pure chance, Smith's belief B turns out to be true, but not for the reasons his justification pointed to. It happens that Smith himself gets the job, not Jones.
Oh. So the president's testimony was wrong, or misleading maybe.
Something like that. And entirely coincidentally, Smith also happens to have 10 coins in his own pocket.
The hidden Smith coins, that's the key detail.
That's the kicker. So let's run the scenario through the JTB conditions for Smith's belief B. The man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket.
Okay.
1, is B true?
Yes, because Smith gets the job, and Smith has 10 coins.
Correct. 2, does Smith believe B?
Yes. He formed this belief through logical inference. He holds it.
Right. 3, is Smith justified in believing B?
Yes. He had what seemed like impeccable evidence the president's word, counting the coins in Jones's pocket. His reasoning from that evidence was sound.
Spot on. So all three conditions of JTB are met. Smith has a justified true belief.
He does. But does he know it?
Exactly. Now for the crucial part, the intuition test. Does Smith know that the man who will get the job has 10 coins in his pocket? Almost universally, epistemologists agree.
No, he does not.
Why not? Intuitively.
Because his justification was entirely focused on Jones. The fact that makes his belief true that Smith gets the job and Smith has 10 coins is completely disconnected from the evidence that justified his belief, which was all about Jones. So the truth of his belief, relative to his justification, is just luck.
Pure luck. His justification aimed at the wrong target, you could say, but happened to hit the truth via a completely different path.
That case is so effective. It really highlights how justification can be strong and rational, but if the truth just happens via a completely unrelated route, it just doesn't feel like knowledge. What about Gettier's second case, the Ford in Barcelona one?
Case 2 also involves Smith and Jones, plus a third person, Brown. The setup is that Smith has good but ultimately misleading evidence that Jones owns a Ford. We don't need the specifics of the evidence, just that it makes Smith reasonably justified in believing Jones owns a Ford.
Okay, justified belief, Jones owns a Ford, and what about Brown?
Smith, meanwhile, has absolutely no information about where Brown is located, none at all.
Okay, so Smith is justified in believing Jones owns a Ford. What does he do with that?
Right. Now, Smith, being a rational thinker, uses a basic rule of logic called disjunction introduction.
Meaning or, like adding an or statement.
Exactly. This rule says that if you are justified in believing any proposition A, you are also justified in believing A or B for any other proposition B.
Okay, that makes sense logically. If A is true, then A or B must be true too.
Right. So if Smith is justified in believing Jones owns a Ford, he's also justified in believing Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona, or Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Boston or anywhere else. The justification for the first part, Jones owns a Ford, carries over to justify the entire disjunctive statement.
So Smith forms the belief either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona, and he's justified in believing that.
Yes, precisely. He's justified because he's justified in the first part.
And here comes the twist for case 2.
The twist is twofold. First, it turns out Smith's initial evidence was misleading. Jones does not own a Ford.
Ah, so the first part of the or statement is false.
Correct. But by sheer luck, completely coincidentally, Brown is actually in Barcelona.
The Barcelona connection saves the truth of the belief, because only one part of an or statement needs to be true.
Exactly. So let's check the JTB conditions for Smith's belief P. Either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona.
Okay. 1. Is P true?
Yes, because the second part, Brown is in Barcelona, is true.
2. Does Smith believe P?
Yes, he inferred it and holds the belief.
3. Is Smith justified in believing P?
Yes, he was justified in believing the first part, Jones owns a Ford, and that justification logically transferred to the entire disjunction.
So again, justified true belief is present, JTD is met.
It is. But intuitively, does Smith know that either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona?
It feels like no again.
Right. The overwhelming intuition is no. His justification for the belief was entirely based on Jones owning a Ford, which turned out to be false. The fact that makes the belief true Brown being in Barcelona is entirely unrelated to his justification. He had zero clue about Brown's location.
The truth of the belief is totally accidental relative to his evidence.
Exactly. It's luck again.
These two cases are so powerful. They show that even with entirely rational and seemingly reliable processes, taking expert testimony, using perception, applying valid logic, you can end up with a justified true belief that feels like luck, not knowledge.
Yeah, the justification doesn't appropriately connect to the fact that makes the belief true.
And that sparked an explosion of work in epistemology, right? Philosophers started looking for what was missing from JTB.
They did. And they also realized that the structure of a Gettier case wasn't entirely new. There were precursors.
You mean cases like Dharmakirti's Mirage from like the 8th century?
Yes, exactly. This example from the 8th century Indian philosopher Dharmakirti is often cited as a much earlier discovery of a Gettier-style problem.
Wow. Okay, what's the scenario?
A thirsty nomad in the desert sees what appears to be an oasis, it's actually a mirage, and forms the belief there is water in the valley.
Okay, let's break that down. Belief. Nomad believes there's water. Justification. His sensory experience of seeing the mirage seems to justify this belief, especially in a desert context where you'd expect water at an oasis.
Right. Seems reasonable. Now, the twist. The oasis he sees is just a mirage. It's an illusion.
Okay, so his justification is based on something false.
Yes. But purely by coincidence, there is actually water in that very valley, just below the surface, hidden from sight where the mirage is located.
No way. So the belief there is water in the valley is actually true.
It is true. So the nomad has a justified true belief. Belief, truth, justification are all seemingly met.
But does he know?
Intuitively, Dharmakirti argued, no, the nomad doesn't know there is water there. His justification was based on an illusion, the mirage. The truth of his belief relies on a fact, the hidden water, that is completely disconnected from his evidence.
It's the same pattern. Justification points somewhere misleading. Truth happens by unrelated luck.
Exactly. It's striking that this structure was identified so long ago, continents away.
What about Russell's stop clock? That's another famous one, right? Bertrand Russell.
Yes, a very common and relatable scenario, often attributed to Russell. Imagine you look at a clock that you know is usually reliable. Let's say it shows 4:30. Based on the clock's known reliability, you form the belief it is 4:30.
Okay, belief. It's 4:30. Truth. Let's say it is indeed 4:30 at that exact moment. Justification. The clock is usually reliable, and you're basing your belief on its reading. All JTB met. Looks good.
But the twist is that the clock is actually stopped. It just happens to be 4:30, one of the two brief instances in a 12-hour cycle when a stopped clock shows the correct time.
Ah, okay. So your belief is true and justified based on a normally reliable source.
But its truth at this moment is sheer chance. You didn't know the time, you just lucked into a true belief because the reliable mechanism, the clock's movement, had failed.
This really highlights the luck element. Your reliable process led you to a true belief, but its truth wasn't because the process worked as intended in that instance.
Exactly. It's what philosophers call epistemic luck. Your justification process doesn't appropriately track the truth in that particular situation. This is made even clearer in cases like fake barn country.
Ah, yes. Alvin Goldman's fake barn case. That one's a classic, too. Describe that one for us.
Okay, imagine Henry is driving through a rural area. Unbeknownst to him, this area is filled with barn facades, structures that look exactly like barns from the road, but are just fronts, maybe for a movie set or something.
So lots of fakes around.
Right. But there is, let's say, only one genuine barn in the entire area. As Henry is driving, he happens to look at the only real barn and forms the belief that is a barn.
Okay, let's check JTB.
Okay.
Belief. Henry believes that is a barn. Truth. It is a barn. He's looking at the real one. Justification. Well, visual perception is a normally reliable way of identifying objects like barns. His eyes are working fine. The light is good.
Right. His visual system is functioning correctly in processing the image of the real barn, so seems justified. All JTD conditions appear to be met.
But intuitively, does Henry know it's a barn?
The strong intuition, shared by most philosophers, is no. His belief is true, but its truth in this specific instance is highly lucky given the environment.
Because if he'd looked almost anywhere else.
Exactly. If he had looked at almost any other structure in the area, his reliable visual process would have led him to form a false belief. That is a barn when it's a fake. The source points out that certain facts about Henry's environment, that it is filled with barn facades, if known, would undermine his confidence in the belief. This environment makes his true belief epistemically precarious or unsafe.
It feels like his reliable process just got lucky because it happened to focus on the one non-fake object. The context is super misleading.
Precisely. It highlights how the surrounding environment and the alternative possibilities, like looking at a fake barn, matter for knowledge, even if they don't directly bear on the reliability of your process in the specific instance you're considering.
Okay, how about the sheep in the field? That one is also quite well known, by Chisholm.
Yes, this case, developed by Roderick Chisholm, is similar in structure to the mirage and fake barn country. Imagine you're standing outside a field and you see something in the distance that looks exactly like a sheep. Maybe it's white, fluffy, standing in a field.
Looks just like a sheep.
So, based on this visual evidence, you form the belief there is a sheep in the field.
Okay, belief. Yes, you believe there's a sheep. Justification. Visual perception of something that looks exactly like a sheep in a field seems like good evidence, providing justification.
The twist. What you are actually looking at is not a sheep, but maybe a big, fluffy Pyrenean mountain dog that looks remarkably like a sheep from a distance. Or maybe it's cleverly disguised, like in some versions.
So what you're seeing isn't a sheep.
Correct. However, entirely hidden from your view behind a large hill or a rock in the middle of the field, there is a real sheep.
Ah, so the belief There is sheep in the field is true, even though what you're looking at is a dog.
Yes. JTB is met. You believe there is a sheep, hidden, and you're justified by seeing something that appears to be a sheep, the dog.
But you don't know it.
Right. Your justification is based on seeing a dog, while the truth of your belief depends on an unseen sheep. Your visual evidence, though seemingly good, is misleading you about the object of your perception, and it's purely lucky that the field happens to contain a different unperceived sheep. The source says clearly, only luckily, therefore, is your belief both justified and true.
It seems like a really common theme in these cases is that the reason or evidence for the belief is somehow disconnected from the actual fact that makes the belief true. There's a gap.
That's exactly right. There's a kind of mismatch or, disjunction between the grounds of belief and the truth maker. Let's look at the pyromaniac case from Brian Skirms, which illustrates this mismatch with causes, not just evidence.
The pyromaniac. Okay, how does that work?
Imagine a pyromaniac strikes a match. They believe the match will light, and they believe it lights for the usual reasons. The friction generates heat, reacts with the chemicals on the match head in the presence of oxygen, causing combustion.
Standard stuff. Seems like a justified belief about how matches work.
Yeah, based on common knowledge, maybe past experience. So, belief, match lights. Truth, the match does light. Justification, based on their understanding of combustion. JTB met.
Okay, what's the twist?
The twist is, in this specific instance, the match light's not for those reasons. Unbeknownst to the pyromaniac, some strange unknown Q radiation happens to be present, maybe from a nearby experiment or something. And it's this radiation, not the friction and oxygen, that actually causes the match to ignite.
Whoa. So again, the truth of the belief, the match lights, is caused by one factor, Q radiation, while the justification is based on completely different, and in this case incorrect, assumptions about the cause, friction, oxygen.
Exactly. The causal basis for the justification doesn't align with the actual causal basis for the truth. So, intuitively, the pyromaniac doesn't know the match lit, even though they had a justified true belief.
That's another clever variation. It's not just about misleading evidence, but potentially a misleading causal story behind the truth. What about the Tom Gravitt case? That one seems a bit different, involving potential counter-evidence you're unaware of.
Yes. The Tom Gravitt case from Lehrer and Paxson presents a scenario where your justification is strong, but there are facts out there that would undermine it, even if you don't know about them.
Okay, set it up.
Imagine you're standing near a library, and you see your best friend, Tom Gravitt, running out. He's got a book tucked under his arm, maybe looking shifty, and a security guard is shouting after him, "Stop, thief!"
Okay, that sounds like incredibly strong evidence that Tom just stole a book.
It does. Based on this powerful sensory evidence and the context, you form the belief Tom stole the book. Seems highly justified.
So, belief. Tom stole the book. Justification. Strong visual evidence. Guard shouting. Context. Now let's assume for the sake of the Gettier structure that Tom did actually steal the book. So, truth, yes. JTB met.
Right. Looks like JTB is met. But the twist is that you're unaware of a crucial piece of information. Tom has an identical twin brother, Buck, whom you've never met or heard of.
Identical twin. Uh-oh.
And furthermore, Tom's mother, who let's assume is maybe misguided or lying to protect her sons, is prepared to testify under oath that Tom was actually in Hawaii at the time, and therefore it must have been Buck who ran out of the library.
Wow. So even if Tom did do it, and even if the mother's testimony would be false, the mere existence of this potential counter-evidence changes things.
That's the idea. The existence of the identical twin and the mother's potential testimony, even if you're unaware of them, and even if the testimony is ultimately false or misleading, acts as what's called an undermining defeater.
A defeat?
Yeah, it's a truth that, if you knew it, would severely weaken or defeat your justification for believing Tom stole the book. If you suddenly learned about Buck and the mother's story, you'd have to suspend judgment, right? You wouldn't be so sure it was Tom anymore.
Definitely not. I think, wait, maybe it was Buck?
Exactly. So, the Tom Gravitt case suggests that for knowledge, your justification needs to be robust enough to withstand such potential defeaters, even ones you're not aware of. The mere existence of this undermining possibility prevents you from knowing, even if your belief is true and based on strong initial evidence.
This is fascinating.
Okay.
These cases, from Gettier's originals to these later variations like the Mirage, the Clock, the Barnes, the Sheep, the Pyromaniac, Tom Gravitt, they all reveal different ways that justified true belief can fall short of genuine knowledge.
That's right.
Often because of some kind of epistemic luck, where the justification and the truth are disconnected, or because the justification is vulnerable to misleading environments or unknown truths.
Exactly. The Gettier problem isn't just one single type of problem. It's really a family of problems, showing that JTB is insufficient. It immediately sent epistemologists scrambling to figure out how to modify or replace the JTB analysis.
They needed something that would exclude these weird Gettier cases while still including genuine instances of knowledge.
Yeah, and the debate was often driven by trying to capture and explain our strong intuitive judgments about whether knowledge is present or absent in these specific scenarios. The intuitions became the data points.
So what were the first approaches to fixing JTB? Many tried adding a fourth condition, right? Like JTB plus some X factor.
Yes, that was the most straightforward response. Keep the core JTB structure and just add a fourth condition or maybe tweak one of the existing ones that would specifically block the Gettier cases. One early and seemingly plausible idea was the no false premise or no false grounds condition.
Okay, how did that work? What's the idea?
The idea was pretty simple. S knows P only if S's belief in P is not inferred from any false belief or premise.
Let's apply that back to Gettier's originals. Case 1, Smith coins.
Right. Smith inferred, the man who gets the job has 10 coins. From the beliefs, Jones will get the job, which turned out to be false, and Jones has 10 coins, which was true, but about Jones. The false premise, Jones will get the job, seems to be the source of the problem there.
Okay, that fits. What about case 2, the Ford Barcelona one?
Smith inferred the disjunction. Either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona from his justified but false belief Jones owns a Ford. Again, a false premise was involved in the inference.
So if we add not inferred from any false belief as a fourth condition, it seems to block Gettier's original cases pretty neatly.
It does. That's why it was an attractive early proposal. However,
There's always a however.
Always. It quickly became apparent that not all Gettier cases involve inference from a false belief. Think about the fake barn case with Henry.
Right. Henry just looks at the barn and believes that is a barn. He doesn't seem to infer it from anything false. It's direct perception.
Exactly. His belief is based on direct visual perception, which is usually reliable, yet it's still a Gettier case because of the misleading environment. So the no false premise condition doesn't rule out fake barn country.
So the no false premise condition might be necessary, maybe, but it's not sufficient to rule out all Gettier problems.
Precisely. It doesn't cover these cases of non-inferential knowledge where luck can still play a role due to the environment or other factors. There were attempts to refine this, like Lehrer's idea of no core false evidence, but the basic challenge from non-inferential cases like fake barn country remained for this style of solution. It wasn't quite capturing the whole picture.
Okay, so that leads to another attempt, the defeasibility condition, proposed by Lehrer and Paxson again.
Yes, in 1969, they proposed that knowledge is undefeated, justified true belief. The core idea is that for S to know P, S must have JTB that is not defeated by any existing truth.
We mentioned defeaters with Tom Gravitt. Can you explain that concept again? What's a defeater?
Sure. A defeater for your belief P is some truth, let's call it Q, such that if you were to become justified in believing Q, you would no longer be justified in believing P. It's basically some fact out there that, if known, would undermine your current justification.
So it's not enough for your justification to be strong based on what you do know. It must also not be undermined by relevant truths you don't know.
That's the essence of it. Your justification has to be resilient to the total body of truth. Let's apply this to Gettier's case. Iakin. Smith believes P. The man who gets the job has 10 coins. His justification relies on Jones getting the job. The truth Q is Smith himself will get the job. If Smith learned Q, his original justification for P, which flowed through Jones, would be completely undermined. So Q is a defeater.
And for Tom Gravitt, the truth about the identical twin buck and the mother's potential testimony acts as a defeater for the belief Tom stole the book.
Exactly. Even if you don't know about them, their existence as truths in the world potentially defeats your claim to knowledge, according to this view.
So knowledge requires JTB, plus the absence of any such undermining truths, any defeaters. This seems quite promising. It addresses the Tom Gravitt intuition directly.
It was a very influential approach, and it seemed to capture the problem in many Gettier cases, this idea that there's some hidden truth that messes things up. However, defining exactly what counts as a relevant defeater became very complicated.
How so?
Well, some truths might seem to undermine your justification in a purely technical sense, but intuitively, they shouldn't prevent knowledge. For example, maybe there's a truth that slightly lowers the probability of your belief without fully undermining it. Does that count? This led to really complex debates about different kinds of defeaters, rebutting defeaters, undercutting defeaters, misleading defeaters. It got quite technical.
Okay, so defining defeasibility precisely was a challenge. Moving beyond just adding a fourth condition, some philosophers looked at changing the relationship between the conditions, right? Like causal theories.
Right. Alvin Goldman, again, in 1967, proposed a causal theory of knowledge, particularly for empirical knowledge, knowledge based on experience. The core idea is that for S to know P, there must be an appropriate causal connection between the fact P and S's belief in P.
How did that work in a simple case?
For a simple case like seeing a tree, the presence of the tree causes photons to hit your retina, which causes neural activity, which causes your visual experience, which causes your belief that there's a tree. So the fact, the tree being there, is part of the causal chain leading to the belief.
Okay, that makes sense. How does that handle Gettier cases?
Well, let's look at Gettier's original Smith coins case. Smith's belief the man who gets the job has 10 coins was caused by the president's testimony and seeing Jones's coins. But the fact that makes the belief true, namely that Smith is getting the job and Smith has 10 coins, is not what caused Smith's belief.
Right, those facts were irrelevant to how he formed the belief.
Exactly. There's no appropriate causal connection between the truth maker and the belief. So the causal theory says it's not knowledge.
That seems to work for that case. But what about the altered case you mentioned from the source? The tricky one where the president lied because Smith was getting the job, and maybe Smith's own coins jingled, subtly leading him to count Jones's. Here, the facts making the belief true are part of the causal history leading to the belief.
That altered case is precisely a challenge for simple causal theories. Even if the truth-making facts are somehow involved in the causal chain leading to the belief, it still feels like a Gettier case, doesn't it? It still feels like luck is involved in a problematic way.
Yeah, it does.
This highlights the difficulty. What counts as an appropriate causal connection? Does it have to be direct? Does the belief have to be caused by the specific state of affairs it's about, in the right way? Defining the right kind of causal relation turned out to be really tricky and seemed to run into similar problems as defining proper justification or defeasibility. It's hard to pin down appropriate.
Okay, so adding conditions and focusing on causality both ran into difficulties. The search for JTB plus X also fueled a broader, really fundamental debate in epistemology about where justification or knowledge-conferring properties actually reside. This is the internalism versus externalism debate.
Yes, this is a major dividing line in contemporary epistemology, and it cuts across many of these proposed solutions. Internalists argue that whether a belief is justified or constitutes knowledge depends entirely on factors that are internal to the subject's mind, or at least accessible to the subject through reflection.
Internal meaning, mental states, thoughts, evidence they're aware of.
Right. What's internal can be understood in a couple of main ways. One is accessibilism. The justifying factors must be things the subject is aware of or can become aware of just by reflecting. Think Chisholm. Oh no. You should be able to know, just by thinking about it, what your evidence is and whether it supports your belief.
Like you can introspect and see your reasons.
Exactly. A stronger version even says the justificatory status itself. The fact that you are justified must be accessible. A potential worry here, though, is that access itself might be an epistemic notion, maybe leading to some circularity in defining justification.
And the other internalist view? Mentalism.
Mentalism, associated with people like Coney and Feldman, they say internal states are simply mental states, regardless of whether they are reflectively accessible. So maybe subconscious memories or processes could count as internal justifiers. This avoids the access circularity worry, but faces questions about whether it truly captures the core internalist intuition that justification is about what's available to the believer in some meaningful sense.
And internalism generally focuses on having good reasons, right? Propositional justification.
Yes. Typically, internalism focuses on propositional justification, whether you have good reasons or evidence available to you that would justify the belief. This is distinct from doxastic justification, which is about whether you actually based your belief on those good reasons. Internalists often say knowledge requires both propositional justification and a proper basing relation, which itself might involve a causal element often seen as external.
Okay, so internalism grounds justification in the mind or accessible states of the individual. What's the alternative? Externalism.
Externalism takes the opposite stance. It says that justification, or knowledge directly, depends crucially on factors external to the subject's mind or conscious awareness.
Like what kind of factors?
Often these are relations between the believer and their environment, or the reliability of the cognitive process used to form the belief, or the causal connection between the belief and the world. The intuition is that what matters for knowledge is how your belief is objectively connected to the truth, regardless of whether you can introspectively verify that connection.
So if your belief that there's a tiger nearby was actually caused by a real tiger, that external causal link matters, even if you can't internally prove the link exists.
Exactly. Externalism emphasizes these natural dependencies, reliable connections, how well your belief tracks the truth in the actual world.
And this is where the Norman, the clairvoyant case becomes a classic challenge, specifically aimed at externalism, particularly reliabilism.
Yes, Lawrence Bonjour used the Norman case to push hard on the intuition that mere external reliability isn't enough for justification. Let's recap Norman.
Okay.
Norman, for some unknown reason, has this perfectly reliable clairvoyant power to know the president's location. He doesn't know he has it, nobody told him. One day, via this reliable power, he forms the belief the president is in New York City. Let's assume the belief is true and it came from a 100% reliable source, his clairvoyance.
Okay, true belief, reliable source. Sounds good for externalism.
Right. However, Norman has no evidence whatsoever, no perception, no testimony, no memory trace that he has this power or that this particular belief is true. He just finds himself with this strong conviction out of the blue.
So if you asked him why he believes it,
He had nothing to say. I don't know, I just feel like he's in New York. He can't point to any evidence or reason accessible to him.
so a simple externalist theory like reliabilism, which just says justification is based on the reliability of the process, seems committed to saying Norman is justified because his clairvoyance is reliable.
Exactly. The process is reliable, so the belief it produces should be justified, according to simple reliabilism. But intuitively, Norman feels completely unjustified. He has no reason to trust this sudden belief.
Yeah, that intuition is strong. It seems like he shouldn't believe it even if it's true and reliably formed.
Right. This apparent disconnect between external reliability and intuitive internal justification is a major problem for certain externalist views. It seems to strongly support the internalist emphasis on needing accessible reasons or evidence for justification.
How do externalists try to respond to the Norman problem? Do they just bite the bullet and say Norman is justified, despite our intuitions?
Some might, but many try to refine externalism to handle Norman. One approach is to add conditions. For example, maybe the reliable process has to be one that the subject doesn't have reason to doubt, Sosa. Or maybe the relevant reliable processes must originate from certain basic primal cognitive systems like perception or memory, which are evolved or learned in a way that excludes weird, inexplicable powers like clairvoyance, lions.
So trying to build in conditions that rule out Norman without requiring full internal access.
Exactly. Another strategy involves distinguishing different kinds of reliability or justification. Indexical reliabilism, for instance, might argue that while Norman's process is reliable in his world, its lack of connection to our normal sources of evidence, like perception or reason, makes it intuitively non-justifying to us, or maybe non-justifying for Norman if he were to reflect on it. Comesaña, Sosa. They try to build in conditions that exclude Norman without becoming fully internalist. It's an ongoing area of debate.
Okay. Externalism is sometimes seen as having an advantage when dealing with philosophical skepticism, though, isn't it? Like the brain in a vat problem.
It often is, yes. Skeptical arguments frequently raise scenarios like, how do you know you're not a brain in a vat, BIV, being fed all your experiences?
Right, because my experiences would be identical whether I'm here or in a vat.
Exactly. Some internalist views struggle with this because we don't seem to have internal, reflectively accessible evidence that definitively rules out the BIB possibility. How could you from the inside?
Yeah, it seems impossible.
Externalists, on the other hand, can offer a more direct response. They can argue that you don't need internal proof against skeptical scenarios to have knowledge. If your belief that you have hands, for instance, is formed by a reliable process, like vision, in the actual world, and you are not, in fact, a brain in a vat, then, according to reliabilism, you do know you have hands.
Even if I can't prove I'm not a BIV.
Right. Your belief is reliably connected to the truth in the actual world, and that's what matters for the externalist. The fact that you can't rule out a logically possible but presumably false alternative doesn't negate the reliable connection you actually have.
It's like the thermometer analogy we talked about.
Precisely. A reliable thermometer indicates the correct temperature. It doesn't need to have internal reasons or the ability to rule out scenarios where it's being manipulated by a demon. It just needs to function reliably in its environment. Externalists often see their view as aligning better with our common sense conviction that we know a great many things about the world, providing a straightforward way to push back against radical skepticism.
And how do internalists counter skepticism or respond to the externalist points about Norman?
Well, against skepticism, some internalists might defend versions of direct realism, arguing that perception gives us direct, non-inferential awareness of external objects, which provides internal justification. Others might use abductivism or inference to the best explanation. They'd argue that the common sense view, that we're not BIVs, is simply the best explanation for the coherence and predictability of our experiences, and this inference provides internal justification sufficient to counter skepticism, even if it falls short of absolute certainty.
So, appealing to direct awareness or explanatory coherence.
Right. Against the Norman case, internalists simply rely on that strong intuition we discussed, that justification requires something accessible to the believer, some reason or evidence they can point to which Norman lacks. They would say that any theory of justification, externalist or otherwise, needs to account for this powerful internal aspect. They might also argue that externalist responses to Norman often end up smuggling in internalist requirements anyway.
Okay, let's focus back on reliabilism, as it's one of the most prominent and developed externalist theories that really took off partly as a response to Gettier in this search for external factors. Alvin Goldman's process reliabilism is key here.
Yes. Goldman's central proposal, in its basic form, is that a belief is justified if and only if it is produced by a reliable belief-forming process.
And reliable means?
A reliable process is one that tends to produce true beliefs, or at least has a high truth ratio. It produces significantly more true beliefs than false ones in the relevant range of circumstances.
And importantly, it's a historical account, right?
Yes, that's a key feature. What matters for the justification of your current belief is the causal history of that belief, the process that actually brought it about. Was it a reliable one or an unreliable one? It's contrasted with current time-slice theories, often internalists, that only look at the believer's mental states right now, regardless of how they got there.
So, if my belief that it's raining was caused by looking out the window in good light, a reliable process, it's justified. If it was caused by wishful thinking or a coin flip, unreliable processes, it's not.
Exactly.
How does this handle the Gettier problem specifically? Does it do better than just no false premise?
Process reliabilism can address some Gettier cases by arguing that while the general type of process used might be reliable, like vision or inference, the specific process token in that particular instance or environment is not reliable in a way that confers knowledge.
Like in fake barn country.
Right. Henry's visual process is generally reliable for identifying barns, but in that specific misleading environment, relying solely on visual appearance from the road is unreliable for distinguishing real barns from fakes. There are too many relevant alternatives, the fakes, that his process can't discriminate between in that context. So the process isn't reliably connected to truth in that environment. Thus, no justification, or at least not justification strong enough for knowledge.
So it brings the environment or context into the reliability assessment.
Yeah. It often needs to, yes. The reliability needs to be assessed relative to the specific situation or a relevant class of situations.
What about extending this to how confident we are about things, degrees of belief or credences?
Yes, reliabilism has been extended to cover degrees of belief, like being 80% confident it will rain tomorrow. The reliability here isn't just about producing true-false beliefs, but about producing accurate credences.
How do you measure the reliability or accuracy of a credence?
This is often evaluated using scoring rules from statistics and decision theory. The Breyer score is a common one. It measures the accuracy of a probabilistic prediction by calculating the mean squared difference between the assigned credence, say 0.8 for 80%, and the actual outcome, 1 if it rains, 0 if it doesn't. A lower Breyer score over many predictions indicates higher accuracy or reliability.
Okay, so it's about minimizing the error between your confidence level and reality. And you mentioned calibration, too.
Yes, calibration is another important aspect of reliability for credences. A perfectly calibrated forecaster is someone who, on all the occasions they assigned a credence of, say, 80%, the predicted event occurred exactly 80% of the time. For cases where they assign 50%, the event occurred 50% of the time, and so on. Your probabilities match the actual frequencies.
That seems crucial for reliability.
It does. There's debate about which scoring rule or measure, Breyer, calibration, etc., is the best standard for assessing the reliability of credence-forming processes. But the general idea is that reliabilism can be applied to these graded belief states too.
So reliabilism provides a robust framework, it seems, but it faces its own specific challenges, even beyond Norman the Clairvoyant. One is the famous new evil demon problem.
Yes. This thought experiment, often attributed to Keith Lehrer and Stuart Cohen, is designed to test externalism, particularly reliabilism, directly.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Imagine a person, let's call her Demonica, whose sensory experiences and internal reasoning processes are exactly the same as yours, moment to moment. She looks outside and sees what appears to be a tree. She remembers events from her past. She uses logic to deduce things. Internally, her mental life is indistinguishable from a normal person's.
Okay, sounds normal so far.
But, unbeknownst to her, she is living in a world controlled by a powerful evil demon who is constantly manipulating her experiences and the external world such that almost all of her beliefs about the external world are false. When she seems to see a tree, there's no tree. When she seems to remember something, it didn't happen. Her belief-forming processes, like vision of the external world, memory, are highly unreliable in this demon world.
So internally, it feels identical to our world. She has the same subjective evidence, the same reasoning patterns, but externally, her processes are failing constantly.
Precisely. Now, the crucial intuition test. Are Demonica's beliefs justified?
Well, from her perspective, she's doing everything right. She's using her senses, her reason, just like we do. It feels like she should be justified, even if she's tragically wrong.
That's the strong intuition most people share. Demonica's beliefs seem justified because she's internally identical to someone in a normal world whose beliefs are justified. She's being perfectly rational given her experiences. But standard process reliabilism says that justification depends on the reliability of the process in the world the subject inhabits.
And in the demon world, her processes are unreliable for external beliefs.
Exactly. So simple reliabilism seems forced to say her beliefs about the external world are not justified.
And that clashes strongly with the intuition that she is justified, from an internal perspective at least.
Right. This is seen as powerful support for internalism, the idea that justification must depend on something internal, because the internal states of the demon world subject are identical to ours, and ours are justified, presumably. It suggests reliability in the actual world isn't the whole story for justification.
How do externalists respond? Do they have answers to the demon?
They do try. Again, some refine the notion of reliability. Maybe justification depends on reliability in normal worlds, not necessarily the subject's actual world. Or maybe indexical reliabilism comes in, again, distinguishing reliability relative to the actual world versus the subject's world, perhaps allowing that Demonica has some kind of justification, even if it's not the kind that reliably tracks truth in her world. It's another point where externalists have to refine their view to accommodate strong counter-intuitions.
Okay, another major challenge for process reliabilism we need to cover is the generality problem. This sounds fundamental.
It is. It's a really thorny issue for process reliabilism, raised early on by Goldman himself and others like Feldman. The problem is this. How do you identify the relevant belief-forming process type whose reliability determines the justification of a specific belief token?
What do you mean?
Okay, suppose you form a belief, say there's a cardinal outside my window, by seeing it.
Right.
That particular event, you're forming that specific belief at that moment, is an instance of many different types of processes.
Like
vision, color vision, vision in daylight, visual bird identification, visual identification of a cardinal, perceptual belief formation while slightly distracted, belief formation on a Wednesday morning. You get the idea.
Yeah, you could describe the process at many different levels of detail.
Exactly. And each of these process types will likely have a different reliability rate. Vision might be generally reliable. Visual identification of distant birds in fog might be unreliable. Visual identification of cardinals by an expert birder might be highly reliable. Which process type's reliability is the relevant one that determines whether this specific belief, there's a cardinal, is justified?
That seems like a crucial choice. If you pick a very narrow, specific type, visual experience of this cardinal at this angle at this exact moment, it might only have one instance. Making reliability measurement impossible reliability is a statistical property.
Right. A type with only one member is either 100% reliable if true or 0% reliable if false, which doesn't seem right.
But if you choose a very broad type, like just belief formation, it might be unreliable overall, even if this specific instance, using vision in good light, was perfectly reliable.
Precisely. The choice of the process type seems potentially arbitrary, yet it dictates the reliability assessment and thus the justification status of the belief. Reliabilism needs a principled, non-arbitrary way to specify the relevant process type for any given belief.
Have there been proposed solutions?
Yes, several. One influential idea is appealing to common sense typing or psychological realism. The idea is that there are natural, basic level categories of cognitive processes, like vision, memory, simple inference, that correspond to how we ordinarily think about and categorize belief-forming processes, maybe linked to cognitive modules identified by psychology.
So the relevant type is the one that aligns with our folk psychology or the actual architecture of the mind.
That's the hope, that the relevant types are things like perception, introspection, deduction, etc., as ordinarily understood. Empirical work in psychology on basic level categorization might help identify these. This approach tries to ground the solution in how human cognition actually works, rather than purely abstract philosophical possibilities. But whether it fully solves the problem is still debated.
So reliabilism offered a really compelling externalist alternative post-Gettier, focusing on truth conduciveness. But it faced serious hurdles with cases involving misleading environments. Gettier, subjects lacking internal access to reliability. Norman, brain in a vat type scenarios. Demon, and this fundamental difficulty of specifying process types. Generality.
That's a very good summary of the key challenges, and the debate is absolutely ongoing, with many sophisticated refinements to process reliabilism and other externalist theories attempting to meet these challenges.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What about virtue epistemology? That sounds like a different kind of approach, maybe still externalist, but focusing more on the believer themselves rather than just the process.
Yes, virtue epistemology, particularly associated with figures like Ernest Sosa and John Greco, represents a significant development. It shifts the primary focus of evaluation from belief-forming processes or external causal connections to the cognitive agents themselves and their intellectual virtues or competences.
Intellectual virtues, like being careful or open-minded.
Those can be part of it, but Sosa, for example, often focuses on more fundamental cognitive competences, stable dispositions or skills that reliably lead to truth in a suitable environment. Things like good eyesight, reliable memory, sound reasoning abilities. These are the agent's epistemic skills.
Okay, so how does this relate to knowledge?
The core idea in Sosa's influential version is that knowledge is not just justified true belief, or even reliably formed true belief, but rather apt belief.
Apt belief.
Yes. An apt belief is a true belief that is true because it resulted from the successful exercise of a relevant intellectual virtue or competence of the believer. The truth of the belief has to be attributable to the agent's cognitive skill.
Can you give an analogy?
Sosa uses the analogy of an archer. An archery shot can be accurate, it hits the target, and adroit, it was skillfully shot. A shot is apt if it is accurate because it was adroit. The success is due to the archer's skill.
So a lucky shot that hits the bullseye because of a sudden gust of wind wouldn't be apt, even if it was skillfully released.
Exactly. The accuracy wasn't because of the skill in that case. Similarly, a belief is apt, and constitutes knowledge on this view, only if its truth is achieved through the exercise of the agent's cognitive competence.
How does this framework try to handle the Gettier problem? Where does JTB fail aptness?
The virtue epistemologist argues that in Gettier cases, the belief might be true, and it might even be formed by exercising a generally reliable competence, like Henry's vision or Smith's inference ability, but its truth in that particular instance isn't due to the successful exercise of that competence in that specific situation. It's due to luck or intervening environmental factors.
So in the fake barn case,
Henry has the competence to recognize barns, and he exercises it to form a true belief. That is a barn. But its truth isn't because his barn-recognizing competence successfully tracked the truth in that specific misleading environment. It's because he luckily happened to focus on the one real barn amongst all the fates. The environment prevents his skill from being the reason for his success. The belief isn't apt.
So the truth isn't creditable to the agent's cognitive skill in that scenario, because the skill wasn't reliable there.
Precisely. The connection between the skill and the success is severed by luck or the unfavorable environment. Sosa introduces further distinctions, like animal knowledge, which is basically apt belief, and reflective knowledge, which involves aptly believing that one's belief is apt, arguing Gettier cases might fail aptness or only achieve animal knowledge without reflective knowledge.
But our sources also mention challenges for virtue epistemology, specifically from Jonathan Kvanvig, right? Does aptness fully solve Gettier?
Kvanvig raises some important critiques, questioning whether virtue epistemology, even with Sosa's refinements, fully solves all Gettier problems or adequately captures the value we place on knowledge. Regarding fake barn, Kvanvig might argue that Henry's belief is true because he exercised his competence appropriately on a real barn. The problem isn't the competence failing, but that his success was still lucky given the wider environment. The environment defeats knowledge, perhaps independently of aptness narrowly construed.
Well, Kvanvig particularly focused on cases like Tom Grabbit, the one with the twin and the potential false testimony.
Yes. Kvanvig argues that in the Tom Grabbit case, your visual competence to identify Tom might be functioning perfectly, leading to an apt identification in one sense. Yet the existence of the unknown identical twin and the mother's readiness to testify seems to prevent you from knowing, even if you're completely unaware of these facts.
So Kvanvig suggests that factors external to the agent's competence, like these hidden social facts or potential defeaters, play a crucial role in preventing knowledge, a role that virtue epistemology, focused on the agent's abilities, might not fully account for.
That's the line of argument. Kvanvig suggests these cases highlight how certain external environmental or social factors can prevent knowledge regardless of the agent's internal skill or the narrow aptness of their belief. He raises questions about whether virtue epistemology fully explains what makes knowledge distinctively valuable over, say, mere apt belief, especially in contexts where epistemic luck or unknown defeaters loom large.
It seems like every attempt to fix JTB or replace it runs into new counterexamples or tricky boundary cases. We even saw an example of this struggle in action from one of our sources, that proposal from a recent online discussion, the connector theory.
Ah, yes, the connector theory from the Reddit thread. That was an interesting sort of real-time example of someone grappling with Gettier and proposing a JTB plus X style solution.
Right. The proposal was basically knowledge, justified true belief, plus a connector. What was the connector supposed to be?
It was described in a few ways, which was part of the issue. Sometimes as a correct belief in how that justification explains the truth. Other times as a known true explanatory relationship between the justified belief, JB, and the truth, T. The idea seemed to be that you need to correctly understand why your justification leads to the truth.
And it was presented as being context-dependent,
Yeah.
like standards of proof in court.
Right. The proponents suggested this connector was like language or shared understanding, requiring shared assumptions, making it sensitive to context. They also introduced this idea of a signal within the theory, initially defining it quite narrowly as publicly observable evidence that warrants a belief, like something you could literally show to a jury.
Okay, so JTB plus a context-dependent understanding of the link between justification and truth. How did that go over in the discussion? What were the criticisms?
The criticisms were quite pointed and, interestingly, mirrored some of the established problems faced by more formal epistemological theories. One major objection was simply that the connector was too vague and wishy-washy.
Not clearly defined.
Exactly. Its reliance on undefined context and shared understanding made it feel like it could be adjusted after the fact to fit any case, rather than providing a clear predictive framework. It lacked rigor.
Okay, what else?
Another key criticism was that the connector condition didn't seem genuinely distinct from the justification condition itself, if justification is understood robustly. Critics argued that saying you lack a connector because you weren't aware of fact X that undermines your belief is functionally the same as saying your justification wasn't sufficient because you weren't aware of fact X.
So it just relabeled the requirement that justification needs to be strong enough to rule out relevant errors or defeaters.
Pretty much. It didn't seem to add a new independent condition beyond demanding adequate justification in the first place. It just pushed the problem back to defining sufficient justification or relevant context or correct explanation.
Something like it just kicked the can down the road.
That was the feeling, yeah. Critics also worried it might be unfalsifiable or still reliant on luck. You only had a connector if you happen to be aware of the right explanatory relationship, which still felt contingent on what you happen to know. And finally, that initial definition of signal as publicly observable evidence was directly challenged.
Oh, so?
The example of zero-knowledge proofs from cryptography was brought up. In a ZKP, someone can mathematically prove they possess certain knowledge, like a secret key, without revealing the knowledge itself or any information about it that could be publicly observed by others. Yet the verifier gains knowledge that the prover has the secret.
Ah, so you can gain knowledge from evidence that isn't publicly observable in the traditional sense.
Right. This directly contradicted the initial definition of signal. The proponent did clarify later that signal might mean understandable evidence rather than strictly perceptual, but it highlighted how tricky it is to define these components precisely.
That whole discussion really underscores the persistent difficulty of finding the right concepts and definitions to capture knowledge and avoid the Gettier pitfalls, even in a modern, informal setting.
It absolutely does. And the reliance on context in that proposal, even if vague, also echoes ideas that have been developed much more formally in areas like epistemic contextualism, which is another major contemporary approach.
Okay, let's touch on a couple of those other significant contemporary approaches that maybe don't try to just add a forced condition to JTB, but rethink the problem more fundamentally. One is Timothy Williamson's knowledge-first approach. That sounds intriguing.
Williamson's view is quite radical compared to the whole post-Gettier tradition of trying to analyze knowledge. He argues that the entire project of analyzing knowledge into supposedly more basic components like justification, truth, and belief is fundamentally mistaken.
Mistaken how?
He proposes that knowledge is itself a fundamental mental state, perhaps the most general factive mental state, a state that relates you directly to a fact. He argues it's irreducible to other concepts. Instead of trying to define knowledge using J, T, and B, we should put knowledge first and use it to understand other epistemic concepts.
So knowledge isn't built from parts. It's a foundational concept itself. We might use knowledge to explain justification, not the other way around.
That's the core idea. It's a significant departure. On this view, while Williamson might agree that things like truth, belief, justification, and perhaps safety, which we'll get to, are necessary for knowledge, he denies they are the more basic building blocks that define it. Knowledge is simply conceptually prior.
How does that avoid the Gettier problem?
It avoids it by rejecting the very framework that generates it, the idea that JTB, or JTB plus X, provides a complete definition or analysis of knowledge. If knowledge isn't defined as JTB plus X, then cases where JTB plus X are present but knowledge is absent aren't counterexamples to the definition, because that's not the definition.
It sidesteps the problem by changing the game.
In a way, yes. It argues the game was misconceived from the start.
Okay, another approach that deals with our shifting intuitions about knowledge is contextualism. We mentioned it briefly. Can you elaborate?
Sure. Contextualism, in epistemology, is primarily a view about the semantics of the word knows and its cognates. It argues that knows is a context-sensitive term, much like words such as tall, flat, or here.
Meaning its meaning changes depending on who's talking, when, and why.
Exactly. The truth conditions a sentence like S knows P can vary depending on the conversational context in which it is uttered specifically, depending on the epistemic standards that are operative or salient in that context.
How does that help with the Gettier problem or skepticism?
It can offer an explanation for why our intuitions about certain cases might shift. For instance, in an ordinary context where weird possibilities aren't being discussed, we might be inclined to say Henry in fake barn country does know. Low standard. But if someone raises the possibility of fake barns, making that alternative salient, the context shifts. The standard for knowing goes up, and now we deny he knows.
So the word knows requires more in the second context.
Right. More prominently, contextualism is used to address skepticism. In an ordinary, everyday context, the standard for knowing might be relatively low, and we truly say, I know I have hands. When a skeptic comes along and raises the possibility of being a brain in a vat, they effectively raise the stakes of the conversation, shifting the context and elevating the standard for what counts as knowing to an incredibly high, perhaps unattainable level.
So in that specific conversational context, we are forced to admit we don't know by those high standards.
Exactly. Contextualism claims we weren't wrong when we said we knew in the ordinary context, and we're not necessarily contradicting ourselves when we concede to the skeptic in the high standards context. It's the word's meaning or application conditions that have shifted with the context, not necessarily the subject's underlying mental state or evidence.
That's a clever linguistic approach.
Yeah.
How does pragmatic encroachment differ from that? It also deals with shifting standards, right?
Yes. Pragmatic encroachment, often associated with figures like Jason Stanley and Jeremy Fantal and Matthew McGrath, offers a rival explanation for those same shifting intuitions, particularly in response to practical stakes. but it's a different kind of explanation.
Oh, so.
Instead of saying the meaning of the word knows changes with conversational context, pragmatic encroachment argues that practical factors, what's at stake for the subject, can actually affect whether the subject meets the conditions for knowing in the first place. It's not just semantics, it's about the conditions for knowledge itself.
And the bank cases are the classic example here, right? Low stakes versus high stakes.
Yes, Stanley's bank cases are famous. Imagine two scenarios. In both, Hannah and her partner need to deposit a check by Saturday. In both, Hannah was at the bank the previous Saturday and saw it was open. Her evidence is identical in both cases.
Okay.
In the low-stakes case, missing the deadline isn't a big deal. Her partner asks if the bank is open Saturday. Hannah relies on her memory from last week and says confidently, yes, I know it is.
Seems reasonable.
In the high-stakes case, however, missing the deadline means severe financial penalties. Maybe their mortgage payment will bounce. The exact same evidence, memory from last week, the same question from her partner. But this time, Hannah hesitates and says, I don't know for sure. Things might have changed. I'd better check online just to be safe.
The evidence is the same, but her willingness to claim knowledge changes because the risk is higher.
Exactly. Pragmatic encroachment suggests that this isn't just Hannah being more cautious in her speech. It suggests that in the high-stakes case, because so much is practically on the line for her, a higher epistemic standard must be met for her belief to actually count as knowledge. Or, perhaps more radically, the practical factors somehow directly influence whether she has sufficient justification or meets the knowledge condition.
So practical interests encroach upon the purely epistemic conditions for knowledge.
That's the idea. It's controversial because it breaks down a traditional separation between practical rationality, what's wise to do, and theoretical or epistemic rationality, what's reasonable to believe. It suggests that whether you know can depend not just on your evidence and reliability, but also on how much the truth of that belief matters to you practically.
Wow. Okay, let's try to pull this all together.
Yeah.
We started with what seemed like a simple, intuitive three-part definition of knowledge, justified true belief that seems solid for centuries.
Right, JTB.
Then, in 1963, Edmund Gettier published this incredibly short but devastating paper showing JTB wasn't sufficient. You could have JTB that still lacked knowledge, typically because of some kind of luck connecting the justification to the truth.
Exactly. The Gettier cases revealed a fundamental flaw.
And this inadequacy wasn't easily fixed by just adding a simple fourth condition like no false premises, or even something more complex like no defeaters, or requiring an appropriate causal connection. Each attempt seemed to run into its own counterexamples or definitional problems.
That's right. The post-Gettier literature is just full of ingenious proposals and equally ingenious counterexamples.
And this whole process opened up these fundamental debates. Is justification internal, accessible to the mind, or external, dependent on reliability or environmental factors?
The internalism-externalism divide became central.
Is knowledge about having reliable processes, reliabilism, or exhibiting cognitive virtues, but you have epistemology?
Different externalist flavors emerged.
And it even led some philosophers to question the entire project of defining knowledge in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Maybe knowledge is fundamental. Williamson's knowledge first.
A radical rethinking.
Or maybe our use of the word knows is sensitive to conversational context, contextualism, or even practical stakes, pragmatic encroachment.
Yeah, exploring the semantics and pragmatics became important too.
It's just remarkable. We started with JTB, saw how Gettier cases revealed its inadequacy, and explored this huge, complex landscape of attempts to patch it, replace it, or rethink the whole endeavor.
That's the legacy of the Gettier problem. It completely revitalized epistemology in the 20th century and led to this incredibly diverse and honestly still quite fragmented landscape of competing theories we see today. Despite decades of intense work and brilliant philosophical minds focused on it, there is still no single, universally accepted definition or analysis of knowledge that fully satisfies everyone and resolves all the counterexamples and puzzles.
Some of our sources framed this lack of consensus on such a core concept as a kind of modern crisis in epistemology. Does that feel right?
Well, crisis might be strong, but it certainly represents a persistent and fundamental challenge. When philosophers can't reach a stable consensus on what knowledge is, it can feel like the foundations are shaky. It might push the field towards reevaluating its methods, perhaps becoming more integrated with scientific studies of cognition, like in naturalized epistemology, or, as Williamson suggests, accepting knowledge as a fundamental starting point rather than something to be built from other parts. It forces ongoing reflection on what we're even trying to achieve with an analysis of knowledge.
It's really remarkable how a simple logical structure, justified true belief that is true by luck, could cause such profound and lasting disruption and generate so much philosophical activity. The quest to define knowledge is clearly far from over.
It certainly is. The Gettier problem isn't just some historical footnote. It's a living challenge that continues to drive research and shape how we think about the very nature of understanding, evidence, justification, and epistemic success itself.
So, as you, our listeners, go about your day, evaluating claims you hear, or deciding what you're confident in, maybe think about the role of luck, evidence, justification, and reliability in your own beliefs. When do you truly feel confident saying you know something?
Yeah, and can you identify moments where someone might have really good evidence, and they might even be right, but you'd still hesitate to say they actually knew it? Maybe because their success felt a bit too lucky or their environment was misleading.
And maybe consider this as a final thought. If, after all this deep philosophical exploration and intense debate spanning decades, we still can't reach a definitive agreement on exactly what knowledge is, what does that imply?
Is it a limitation of philosophical analysis itself? Or perhaps does it reflect something about the nature of knowledge, that it's inherently more complex, maybe more contextual, perhaps even more fundamentally resistant to simple definition than we initially assumed? Is there always going to be a bit of mystery at its core?
A complex and perhaps unsettling question to ponder. Join us next time on The Deep Dive for another exploration of fascinating ideas.